So today's event was originally planned at the Cereals Soil Pit, together with CFE and NIAB, and we just thought rather than letting it go, we would try our best to second best that and recreate that experience. So we've got the NIAB team out there at the Innovation Farm. I'll just unmute them and they can say hello again. Do you want to say hello, Lydia?
Hello.
So it's Dr. Lydia Smith there at NIAB Innovation Farm with the Herbal Leys. And yeah, so, and then we've got James Alexander, who's also joining us live from his tract cab, where he is out in the field today. So do bear with us with any potential technical hiccups that we might find there, but we are always innovating and wanted to try and give you that experience. So let's all imagine that we're stood in that field in Cambridgeshire without the sun on our backs and that I don't look like an air traffic controller. And just delighted to see so many of you here. So encourage you all to share your own experiences. Much of the innovation's happening in your fields as well. So do get involved there. So the idea for today's session is to have a quick overview of different options for alternative breaks in arable rotations. So we will start off talking about cover crops. So we've got Nathan Morris from NIAB talking to us a bit about around an overview, George Crane on mycorrhizal associations, and James Alexander will tell us a bit about his practical experiences. And then we have Lydia Smith talking to us about integrating grass and multi-species lays into rotations with a bit of insight from the on-farm trials within SARIC. And then Emily Cooledge will talk to us about reintegrating livestock and arable livestock collaboration. And James will talk us a bit about his perspectives as an arable farmer. And we've also got Andrew Rouse, who is a sheep farmer who collaborates with the Duxford farm there. And then we'll open up for questions and discussion. So just very, very quickly, just wanted to tell you a bit about Agricology. So we are a network of farmers and researchers and advisors sharing knowledge on agroecology and practice. We do lots of that online and in the field. We have a YouTube channel, and we're a collaboration of many different organisations that are working with agroecological practices, looking at how we can build more resilient, efficient, productive farming systems. So do check that out. Nathan from NIAB, who is going to kick us off with a bit of a run through of cover crops and what we've learned, and an introduction to living mulches as well. So I'll just pass over to Nathan, who hopefully can now control the screen. There we go.
There we go. Perfect. Let me just, whoops, just see if I can. Right, there we go. I have my whizzy pointer as well now. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. I'll do a very brief run through as to a few background details on what cover crops are and what they can do. A couple of longer term sort of results, experiences we've had with trialing these systems, and then a brief overview as to some of the benefits that we've got and some of the limitations, stroke challenges that we still have probably some research to do to try and answer those questions. So to begin with, what is a cover crop? A bit slow. My screen's not updating, so slight technical hitch. Let's hope that comes back in a minute. Here we go. So definition of a cover crop really is primarily grown for the purpose of protecting or improving or augmenting between periods of regular cash crop production. Oh, this is going to be a bit slow. And obviously there are a number of benefits that we can expect from them. There are very well-known, well-quantified measures in terms of reducing erosion, reducing nitrate leaching, and retaining nutrients within the soil. Certainly soil structural benefits with roots and structure opening up the soil porosity, aiding water holding capacity has been well proven in situations. There's obviously benefits from disrupting pest disease cycles, potentially with weed management, although I think that can be a bit of a double-edged sword sometimes, depending on the situation. And obviously there's biodiversity and habitat provision as well through more diversity within our cropping systems. And last but by no means least, there's obviously the benefits from the grazing and forage where we have livestock within our farming systems. There are a number of definitions of cover crops, and I think cover crops usually are described as an overarching term. Within that, there are specific terms for the type of cover crop you're growing. So, for example, a catch crop to recover nitrogen is quite a common one to be used. Green manures for improving nutrition or soil fertility. Companion cropping, where you're essentially growing a bycrop of both the cash crop, which you take to yield, and the cover crop for being used to protect or improve within that system. Then there's living mulches, which I believe we'll discuss a bit more today. And these are typically undersown with the crop and typically intended for weed suppression, but there are other uses for them. And then there's the trap stroke biofumigant properties that some cover crops can deliver as well. In terms of duration of cover crops, there's essentially 4 main categories. So there's the very short season, often less than 2 or 3 months, particularly used after harvest if you're mopping up nitrogen that may otherwise be lost ahead of the next crop. Short season covers, so anything between 3 and 7 months. They're probably the most common, particularly in an arable vegetable rotation.
Using
and then there's the season-long cover crops, which are typically 8 to 12 months, tend to be used more frequently in organic systems rather than conventional rotations, but again used for building fertility. And then there's the longer duration, so at least 12 months, typically associated with sort of permanent perennial cropping systems. But there has been some research in Canada where they used a brassica cover crop for actually alleviating soil compaction, and it was quite severe compaction, and they grew the brassica for 24 months to really aid the soil restructuring. With all cover crops, there's obviously a whole range of different species. I won't go into much detail other than make you aware that there are both legumes and non-legumes. Typical legumes include vetches, clovers, and your peas and beans. Non-legumes can be subdivided into brassicas, so your mustards and radish, which are particularly common. Grass type, so rye, oats, and then others which are particularly beneficial if we're all looking at rotational implications where you may have brassicas within rotations. So Phacelia, buckwheat, chicory, which are less commonly grown with other species. Like with all approaches and cover crops, there are benefits and some considerations as well. Particularly the rotational conflicts are quite common in most of those species. Brassicas, legumes all have potential challenges. But again, depending on the situation, you sort of need to choose your species according to what your aim of and your objective of growing cover crops are. So just to go on to a couple of longer term studies that NIAB have been running with the Agricultural Foundation and the JC Mann Trust. These are long-term, fully replicated trials that have been running now for 11 years. And we've got a number of approaches that we're looking at, but I'll focus today on the cultivation approaches and rotational approaches. So in terms of the cultivation approaches, we use 4 cultivations. So it's a plough, a deep and a shallow non-inversion. So deep typically targeting 20 centimetres cultivation, shallow typically targeting 10 centimetres. A managed approach, which is either or one of the above, the plough, deep or shallow, depending on the conditions at the time of cultivation and the previous history in terms of weed management or potentially a cultivation plan that may have developed over time. And then we use that with or without an autumn cover crop ahead of the spring sown crop rotation. So we have winter wheat followed by the spring breaks. And so far within the study programme, we've had iterations of 4 cover crops. So in 2009, 2011, 2013 and 2018. Just to focus on a couple of the results, mainly on margins and crop performance. Margins we take, basically calculate as the output minus the variable costs and the in-field machinery costs. And we've looked at that across the rotation, so this is over 9 years, and it's the average margin over that time period for the 4 cultivation systems, which are here, either with or without a cover crop. And over that time, we don't actually see a big change in the margin, either with or without the cover crop, so they're very similar. There's obviously the cost associated with the cover crops at roughly 60 to 80 pounds, which includes the seed and the establishment of those. So typically we see probably the best responses coming from the non-inversion type approaches. The plough-based system, we see less response, so typically it costs us slightly more in terms of the associated costs with those cover crops. We don't necessarily see quite the same margin as we get from a sort of non-cover crop system. And these charts here just illustrate the point that with a plough-based system, because we're using a brassica cover crop that we're typically looking at biocultivation, we don't necessarily see so much yield response. So this is just a percentage yield response over a sort of standard rotation. We don't really see many positive responses in a plough-based cultivation approach. Where we use a shallow non-inversion system, you can see there much more of a trend to a positive response, because basically you're allowing that plant material to do the work of a piece of metal. So there are benefits, as I say, in terms of soil structuring from cover crops. In terms of sort of the living mulches or using clover as a bycrop, we have another study where we have quite a complex approach using different rotations with a range of different cover cropping approaches. But for today, I'll just focus on the bycrop with the clover. And then we do different nitrogen strategies. So we have 0 nitrogen, 50% of the standard nitrogen applied to the given crop, and 100% of the nitrogen applied for that crop. And again, over the period, we've been monitoring assessments, including water infiltration and bulk density. Both of those we've seen benefits from the clover in terms of opening up the soil surface structure. In terms of yield performance, we do see some variable levels, and this is preliminary results. We are in a process of drawing longer term conclusions from this work. So we're going to look into a little bit of detail as to why we may or may not see some of those differences. But at the moment, we're typically seeing the stronger responses at the lower nitrogen approaches, which is typical with clover, because obviously higher fertility levels with applied nitrogen will reduce the impact of that within the crop.
I do just have a quick question, Nathan. I think it's from the previous slide, actually, on what factors were the positive and negative effects on yield of covers correlated with?
So that's a big question. As I say, we are trying to look at the data set in a bit more detail to look at various factors, and I think obviously weather will have a big impact on that. The soil type we're on up at Norfolk is a light soil that can suffer from drought stress, and that plays quite an important part both in how well the cover crops perform in terms of establishment and on the following crops in terms of their performance. But we will look at other interactions as well.
Great, thank you.
Some other work, again, AHDB have funded a long-term project that lasted over 4 years, looking at a whole range of different cover crop species. So some of these were grown individually, some were sown as mixes, obviously to try and work out where the best benefits from mixes occurred and understand which components of those mixes performed the best in the situation. And we looked at a whole range of different effects on the crops, soil properties, crop rooting, and obviously yields and margins. So I won't go through it all. There is a report published on the HDB website, which you can now go and read at your leisure. The main focus I wanted to do today was just to cover a little bit on the rooting abilities of cover crops, because at the moment we know different species will grow, and they will have different growth habits, both above and below ground. Obviously, quantifying below ground root growth is quite difficult and expensive, so it's less well quantified. But certain cover crops do have better growth habits. So if we're looking at soil structuring and opening up the pores for better drainage, nutrient retention, some species are better than others. And if my slides move on to the next screen, which I hope they do, we'll see, here we go, there's some basically different root growth through the profile of the soil. So that the y-axis is the depth of the profile of the soil, and different root structures of the different species. So particularly Phacelia and rye, this was actually measured at crop destruction. So it had about 6 months in the ground. The rye and Phacelia had the greatest root length density, which is a measure of volume of roots, essentially. Some of the mixes had better approaches, better root growth compared to the control. But individually, the species, as I say, were particularly the Phacelia and rye that stood out as being particularly good. So just to sum up with a few lessons learned, there are many lessons, and I'm sure we'll have a good debate today as to what those are. But cover crops provide, as I say, certainly well quantified in terms of nitrogen uptake, reducing erosion, and obviously soil structural benefits. Species choice is very important, particularly around setting clear objective as to what you want to achieve. I always say this, but don't expect the cover crops to be the sort of silver bullet. We have to be careful as to setting sort of just one or two objectives, and hopefully that those will be delivered through the particular choices of the species. Early establishment is absolutely key. There's so many times where obviously with the challenges, and I do see this as one of the major challenges of cover crops in that particularly important window, post-harvest, when we're busy cultivations, still harvesting crops, but getting them in August rather than September is absolutely vital for maximising the benefits of those in terms of growth and their recovery of nutrients from the system. There. As I mentioned, there are different characteristics of rooting between the cover crop species. One of the important things, and I think we'll cover this in some of the questions today, so I won't go into it too much, but allow sufficient time between destruction of the cover and cash crop establishment for that, particularly for the spring sown crops on heavy soils. A narrow window between them really is a recipe for major challenges in terms of how the seedbed can be worked down. Cover crops have certainly shown, as I mentioned, to capture that nitrogen very well, typically 25 to 50 kilos of nitrogen, but sometimes up to 90 kilos. One of the biggest challenges, and I get asked this a lot of times, I think there were some questions today, as to when that nitrogen will be released. Unfortunately, it's a very complicated, interactive set of parameters that control when that N is released. Main drivers are soil temperature and soil moisture, but there are plenty of other factors as well, and it's very dependent upon site and season, etc. So it's really difficult to actually be able to quantify when that will be released. There's some evidence that buckwheat scavengers phosphate, which could be potentially very useful in certain situations where we know phosphate levels within the soil can be hard to maintain. And particularly cover crops need to be considered on a rotational basis. And sometimes the benefits aren't clearly seen until a number of iterations of that cover crop are grown. and mainly consider when we're growing those cover crops the cost of the seed and establishment, so that margins, as I say, in the long-term work don't show huge differences, but that's with sort of seed costs kept sort of carefully in check. Sometimes seed costs can get quite expensive. And one note there, non-tangible benefits such as improved water quality and erosion control, I see as a public good, and I hope that as changes in our in the legislative sort of systems of how growers are rewarded will certainly help support those qualities that are of wider benefit to the general public. So that was my summary.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Nathan. Just a quick of oh, I've got some feedback there. I don't know if that's your microphone. We've got a couple of questions. One was why was the radish root length omitted from Cotswold seeds on the when you're looking at root length density?
Yes, that's so sorry. That was it was omitted in that we did measure root length growth of the radish, but what we didn't do is we didn't put the when we took the cores, we didn't put the cores directly over the row where we'd planted the radish, because obviously it's a taproot, so we would have an unfair advantage of just capturing that taproot. So we did it between the rows. Great.
And then a couple of questions around N recovery. So was it worked out based on residue composition or for monitoring SNS or monitoring the following crop? And then Rebecca Inman was just asking if N recovery would be affected by legumes in the mix.
So yeah, but measuring N recovery is quite complex. So we took soil mineral nitrogen cores and tissue samples and looked at the following crop composition as well to look at a nitrogen balance. So it's quite a complex way of looking at it. And again, it's very difficult to actually fine tune as to when that N will be released from those cover crops.
And then I will pick up on it now. We've got a question around pest bridges, which also came up quite a bit in the questions we had beforehand, both in terms of things like flea beetles and aphids, but also slugs. Have you got any comments on that?
Yeah, so anything as a additional crop material that, for example, for slugs, that provides a habitat for slugs will potentially increase those populations. So we do have to be mindful as to how we control the cover crops and also the species selection, so that actually we don't end up, unless you very much particularly want a high biomass type cover crop. So yeah, we do have to certainly take that into consideration. And also green bridges. I think there's more research that needs to be done, but yes, potentially we could potentially have green bridges with certain species, and particularly things like aphids as well. But that's not uncommon with other type systems where, for example, in potato rotations where you've got volunteer potatoes acting as bridges. So again, it's just looking at your rotation and looking at your sort of crop health within that to minimise the risks. Great.
Thanks, Nathan. Okay, so I think we'll move over to George now, who is in the field at Innovation Farm, who's going to tell us a bit about mycorrhizal associations in cover crops.
Fantastic. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Fantastic. So I've had the first technical difficulty of the day because I'm actually at the cereals site, not at the Innovation Farm. But what we have behind me, if you can see that, is some of the longer term herbal leys that Lydia will talk about in a little while. But my project is more interested in the interactions between cover crops and technical issue. Getting questions and I can't see myself.
I'll ask you the questions, don't worry about that.
There you go, I'm back. Sorry about that. So yeah, my project looks at the interactions between cover crops and the arbuscular mycorrhiza. So arbuscular mycorrhiza are symbionts of land plants and were linked to colonization of the land by early microscopic algae land plants about 540 million years ago. arbuscular mycorrhiza are linked to nutrient uptake, drought tolerance, and disease and pest tolerance, and are found in around 70% of lamb plants, and including many of your agricultural crops, excluding the brassicas. Long-term herbal leys and cover crops are known to improve both the diversity and abundance of mycorrhiza in the soil, which hopefully then will interact with following crops. So I've got a number of projects on the go. So firstly, a collaboration with Ferra, which looks at sort of UK diversity of mycorrhiza using DNA-based methods. Then I've got a couple of replicated field trials. So one is that new farming systems trial that Nathan just spoke about. Another is a trial managed by that team at Morley, which has 9 covered crop mixtures, so an oat, a vetch and a radish, grown individually in pairs and as a 3-way mix. And all of these are grown with and without a mycorrhizal inoculum. And finally, we have an innovative farmers project, which looks at the interaction between cover crops and anaerobic digestate on the farm scale. So results today, we found a number of good results on the cover crop side, including sort of nitrate uptake, improved soil structure, and on the mycorrhizal side, we've seen that cover crops, especially legumes, at the new farming systems site were able to increase root length colonization. So that is how much mycorrhiza is in the root of a spring barley crop following that cover crop. And in the remaining year of my PhD, I'm going to look at the diversity of mycorrhizal symbionts in the root of the cash crop following various cover crops or mycorrhizal inoculums, or indeed digestate applications. So any questions, be happy to take them. I think we're doing at the end, and I might go sit in my car in case you can't hear me. Just
Fantastic, George. That's fascinating. I think we're just learning so much about that world and those relationships between mycorrhizae and plants. So that's fascinating work. And I think there were some questions that came up around that. But I think because we are short of time for now, we'll move on to James, and then we'll pick up on some of those questions all together, if that's all right.
Okay, fantastic. Brilliant.
Great. Okay, over to you, James, in your tractor. Oh, except we can't hear you.
Hello. Can everyone hear you? Is that better?
That's better.
So yes, I am live from the tractor in a cover crop field actually. So Katie's asked me to talk about cover crops and what we're up to. We farm both organically and conventionally. So we use cover crops differently on both farms, I suppose. We use mostly on the organic farm, they use for building nitrogen levels. So we can grow our 3 or 4, 5 arable crops in between. We use a mixture. Sometimes we use 2-3 year clover leys, or the field I'm in at the moment actually is a vetch oat ley, or crop, if you like, which we only grow for 1 year. And then on the conventional farm, we mostly just use cover crops in between our wheat, barley, rape crops. But we are, along with Soil Association and various other groups, we're working on a living mulch trial at the moment. So we've got micro clovers established under spring barley, both organically and conventionally, which have actually just germinated in the last 10 days after being in the ground for about 3 or 4 weeks because we've had some rain, with the idea that we can direct drill the next crop into a ley, into a clover, pure clover ley, and leave that clover ley there for however long we feel fit it will last us. So for the organic side, if it means we can direct drill crops without the use of glyphosate, brilliant. It's sort of my goal, because our conventional farms are all direct drilled. We don't move any soil at all and haven't done for about 15 or 16 years. So if we can grow permanent clover leys, direct drill into them year after year, maybe having to stitch a bit more clover in every now and again, I can see us having a bit of a, on our conventional farms, it'll be a hybrid of an organic system, and the organic farms, we've sort of got the benefit of being able to direct drill without the worry of weeds, or very few weeds maybe to what we normally have. I'm currently in a vetch oat field at the moment that we normally establish all our nitrogen fixing lays in the autumn. This year we never got our vetch in this autumn because of the wet weather, so we didn't establish till the spring. And the problem we've now got is we've got vetch that's about 6 inches tall and black grass, which is about 1.5 foot tall. So actually I'm just currently topping over the top of the vetch to take the black grass out, and hopefully now the vetch has had some rain, it will get going. Normally by this time of the year I've got a vetch crop that's about 4 or 5 foot tall, and we're actually thinking of topping the vetch or crimping the vetch rather than topping the black grass. So yeah, that's what we're up to. We have various successes every year. Yeah, we keep trying. There you go, Katie's put a picture up of my crimper and me stood in a very poor state by the looks of it.
So yeah, there's just a few pictures here. So that's the crimper. Yeah, I'll let you talk about it.
That is, yeah, there's a crimper. That's a crop of vetch and oats. We have tried vetch and rye. We found we can crimp the rye better than we can the oats, but we have problems with the rye in the following winter wheat crops. So we've gone back to oats. I think it probably means we can't use the crimper in that situation, but we'll have to use the topper. But, you know, various things. That's, what's that? That's a picture. That's just some over sort of autumn cover crop. There'll be a bit of everything in there. Yeah, we've been trying to mess around with buckwheat to control docks. We put a pure buckwheat crop in the ground in the autumn, well, as early as we can, August, September time. We have had, I think it is having an effect on our docks. We've just got 2 fields that are very bad for docks on the organic farm, and we are getting less. So it's quite a cheap way. We grow our own buckwheat seed. So it's quite a cheap way of controlling docks, which can be quite hungry on machinery to try and hoik the roots out on the surface. So yeah, again, something else we're just trialling on our own, really. But they look nice when they all come into flower in November, as long as they don't get any frosts. That's the crimper again. So yeah, that's what we're doing, really.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks so much, James. I'm aware we're trying to cover a lot of ground, excuse the pun here. So we've had a few questions come through, and quite a few came through beforehand around destruction of cover crops, and how we try and limit the kind of losses that we might see in terms of carbon or nitrogen, or and how. So you've talked a bit about the crimper, James. Is there what else have you worked with, Nathan, in terms of what's the kind of most sensible way and timing of destroying cover crops?
In conventional systems, we still are pretty reliant on glyphosate. The main thing there is to use it in good time to allow, as I say, sufficient time to break down the mulch to cover before the crop. We have, I mean, things like the buckwheat are particularly beneficial in terms they are very frost insensitive, so a little bit of frost and that tends to knock them out quite well. So sometimes a mix with some buckwheat in just reduces that biomass that you then have to control with glyphosate in a conventional system. James is probably better in terms of the organic approaches with crimpers than I am for experience. So James can add anything if he wishes.
Well, yeah, we play around with the crimper. I'm afraid we still fall back on the plough. We do have it's what you do, the time between the crimping and the next crop. Normally when we're crimping, vetch is probably end of this month. We then probably won't put a wheat crop in it until October at the probably earliest. So it's what we do over that period. We did play around with another cover crop after the vetch last year, which it did come not as well as we hoped, because we did a very dry autumn again, which is, I've sort of put my hope on the white clover living mulch idea now. I would argue, though, about you're killing off a cover crop in conventional system with glyphosate too early. We actually have more success killing it off after we've drilled the next crop. But I think that has a lot to do with how long you've been direct drilling for, and how far down the soil organic matter is, and how good your soil's working, really. We find we tend to drill, then spray the cover crop off. We have a better success, and actually less pest control, i.e. slugs, less slug problems spraying the cover crop off later. But that's just what we found. So
brilliant, thanks James. And yeah, anyone else on the call, do feel free to share your own experiences in the chat as well. I'm sure lots of you are trying different methods of destruction, and yeah, interested in your experiences too. We will have the next poll now. Just with what a couple of things that we've covered there really is around the duration of the cover, and the method of destruction. So this one's just on, if you're currently using cover crops, how long do you leave them down for? So there we go. We've got actually 100% of people on, sorry, that didn't work very well, did it? Let's try again. There we go. Still coming up with very similar results. So the majority of you looking at that kind of going through to spring cover, I would guess, in terms of the duration, but some of you considering longer term, I imagine, and some of you doing those longer term breaks already. And yeah, perhaps with the wet conditions this winter as well, perhaps some people have looked at cover crops that hadn't considered them before. So, and then the next poll is just looking at if you would you consider integrating Leys? So if you've had these cover crops in the system, would you consider integrating either a grass clover lay, a simple grass lay, into your systems, or given the wet winter, did you actually consider a fallow, or are you not prepared to do this at all? Great, thank you very much. So yeah, a lot of you there would consider a grass clover lay in your systems, and 50% consider a more diverse lay. So we've got Lydia Smith, hopefully, on the line. We'll pick up on some of the cover crop questions at the end as well, because I have had a few more questions come through here. We've got Lydia, are you there?
Right, I've unmuted you.
Hello?
Lydia's going to talk us through integrating grass and herbal lays into the arable system. So you're on, Lydia.
Thank you, and you can hear me, Katie?
We can.
Excellent. So I hope that everyone can see more or less that I'm sitting down in amongst a herbal lay here. We were actually going to do this at Cereals, but we decided to shift here. And in fact, this one is even more lush and well developed. So this was established last year, and it probably on most people's sites, if they were either mowing it or grazing it, it's extremely unlikely it would get as mature as this. But I think it's great to see, you know, you can really get a feel for the diversity of the species here. And each one of these has been carefully chosen in order to have some kind of contribution either to the animal's welfare or biomass that it's eating, or indeed for the sorts of things that are going on below ground. So I think this worked when we tried it. I've picked a little posy worth of the species just to have a bit of a dash through. So we've got a range of different grasses. We've got, for example, dactylus or cocksfoot. We've got festulolium, and regular lolium. But we've also got all sorts of legumes and forms. So we've got red clover, white clover, bird's-foot trefoil, and the big one here, sainfoin. And each of these, oh, and of course we've got other things like chicory. Sorry, there's the chicory. And we've got salad burnets. That's probably not all of them, but it gives you a feel for the amount of diversity that we've got there. And you can see that we get this very complex, complicated canopy. Now, one of the things that we were going to do was to look at what happens below ground. And so some of you will have seen this before, and it's like, oh great, you know, I know that you get this quite interesting diversity. But what we wanted to do in the soil pit was to show you what happens underground. So I came here a bit early, and I hope they can see that. So I'll pick it up a bit. This is the kind of thing that you can see underground. Can you let me put that down? Actually, yep. It's really heavy. So I came and wet this up a little bit earlier. Now, look at this. One of the things that you'll notice is there's all sorts of lovely structure about this. You can see that the clods of soil are holding together. There's lots of organic matter running through the system. You can see different types of roots. You can see the fine ones, and you can see some slightly bigger ones. What's exciting here is you can even see all sorts of fungal stuff that is actually visible to the naked eye. And if you take a piece out, you can see that there's a lot of structure of those roots all running through the soil system. And if I just swivel this round, so here, for example, is a chicory root. And look at the size of it. This has only been established last year, but you can see, I hope, that kind of really big, fat tap root that's running through the soil system. If we turn that over, we can see various roots here. So these fine, rather fleshy ones are due to this clover. And then some of the more diffuse ones you can see running through, those are due to some of those grasses that you can see running through the system, which is in this case lolium. So this is kind of what we wanted to see. It's exciting to be able to see it, albeit in a rather small form. We hope to show you this in a big soil pit. But the importance of this complex, if we can call it a below ground canopy, is that you've got such a lot of different types of organic matter that are running through the soil system. And potentially the sorts of things that George was telling you about, you can have that happening for longer with more diverse types of mycorrhizal species, with more diverse types of rhizobial species that are combining and giving you that nitrogen fixing ability with the various legumes. And you have, and I'd just like to point out that this chicory root that I showed you, that is by no means all of it. I chopped it off trying to get through, but that chicory root would have gone well down, and indeed the sainfoin, which is the pink flowered one that I showed you earlier, that's this one here. That will give you roots that will go down a metre or more depending on the type of soil. So Nathan told you all about the benefits that you can get from the roots and the structure and the organic matter that is going down to the soil. But this, because we're expecting to put this down for 2 years, we're hoping that you can get much more of that and potentially much stronger, longer lasting carbon matter than you could possibly get from a sort of 4 to 6 month cover crop. So, okay.
And there's a question here actually, Lydia.
Go on then.
What was the structure like in that site to begin with, and do you see much improvement over time?
Right, a very good question. Yes, and so the NIAB site is traditionally quite tricky. So it's a heavy, I think it's described as a heavy clay soil. Down below, we go down into thick, heavy blue clay. And because it's been pretty well worked over the last few years, particularly this field here, it's relatively low in organic matter and it has a tendency to cap. So this was a site that was absolutely crying out for some help in terms of cover crops, or indeed for a complex lay like this. So one of the other things I wanted to say is this is a very complex one. It takes a while to establish. There are certain species in it that don't like certain soils. For example, the sainfoin really doesn't like an acid soil. If you go down below about 6.5 pH, then you're not really going to do very well with the sainfoin. But the nice thing about it is because it's so diverse and because you have a lot of species there, if you fail on one year, then the probability is that any space will be made up by the other species that will take over. And I know that having grown this particular ley for about 7 or 8 years now, this particular one was supplied by Cotswold Seeds. There's lots of mixtures out there, but this one looks a little bit different each year. So depending on whether it's a bit cold as you try to establish, or if it's a bit wetter or dry, then different species will tend to be a little bit more dominant. And as you go through and manage it, depending on whether you're grazing or whether you're mowing or whether you're literally just showing it like we are to show farmers what the potential might be, that will give you a change as the years go by. And I'm going to hand over to my colleagues in a moment, but just before I do that, I've got a couple more minutes.
3 more minutes.
I've got 3 more minutes. Just bring exhibit number 2. So this is a different type of ley. This is a much simpler one. You can see from the top there that you've got a number of grasses again. We've got lowlium, we've got birdsfoot trefoil. There is some clover. I've not managed to get it in this site. You're still getting that value, so you can see there's still a lot of organic matter running through. Again, fascinatingly, we've got this, you can actually see these little white tufty bits, there's some fungal growth in there, so you've really got a lively soil in terms of the microbial community, but you've got something that's, you know, nearly as good. It's got a different sort of end point. You're not going to get the biomass that we have in this site behind us, but lots of potential, and maybe something that a different farmer might like to try. So I'm going to hand over to Andrew first. I can make him a space, because Andrew has been feeding his stock on this, and it'd be really nice to get a perspective of what he thinks. Oh, sorry, and I'll give him the microphone.
Hi, Andrew.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can. Hello.
Yeah, there's 2 plots at Duxford, grazing Duxford, and I took 150 sheep over there, weighed and took them over there, batch lambs, and on the Herbal Ley, within the week, well 10 days actually, they put on 2.5, well 1.5 to 2 kilos, pretty good going, and also the second ley, the second plot, there's grass and clover. At once, well, I didn't lose weight, but I didn't certainly put none on. So this is miles better. There's also a plant here, I think that stops the sheep working. I think I believe it worms the sheep as well. But certainly improved my sheep. Really, really impressed with it.
So that's compared to a kind of less diverse sward, but also, do you think there's a benefit from being on kind of disease-free arable land as well?
Oh yeah, well, especially this year and last year when there's sort of drought we're getting now. We've got long roots. What you see behind you, just really good feed. Really pleased with it.
And how far do you have to travel to get to the site? Is it far from?
Oh, it's only about 6 miles, 7 miles.
Yeah.
So it's really pleased.
Oh, brilliant.
Done fantastic on it. Really good.
Brilliant. Oh, well, thanks for that insight, Andrew. And we've got Emily Cooledge at Bangor
We're going to
University.
just go on and go back to Patrick.
Okay, yeah, we could do that.
Really quick.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Just before you do switch to Patrick, or perhaps Patrick can tell us, we've got a question from Henry around the seed cost for the Herbal Ley and the simpler mix, if kind of a bit about the kind of economics.
Sure, yeah. So the complex Herbal Ley has 17 species, and I understand it's a bit more expensive than the simple ones, and they kind of get cheaper as you go down because it's the cost of production of the seed, I suppose.
Great.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm Patrick McKenna, and my role is kind of just to put the numbers on what's really going on in soil and in biomass in these trials. So we've kind of got 3 separate assessments going on. The first one is pretty much just an assessment of soil chemical and biological properties at 2 different depths in Herbal Ley, in the adjacent grass clover lane which we have at each site, and then the adjacent Arable control as well. And this has things like mineral nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, pH, organic matter, etc. And we've got some good results from that at the moment. One thing I've noticed is that the nitrates is going down really big in the herbal leys at this time of year, and less so in the grass clover leys. That's obviously because they're taking up a lot more nitrogen because they're growing more, you know. So that means they're getting a lot more nitrogen in the above ground biomass. So for any farmers interested in green manures and so on, I'm pretty sure that you're getting a lot more nitrogen in these than you are in the grass clover leys. The second one we have is on biofixation itself and its relationship with micronutrient concentration and forage quality as well. And it's mostly aimed at livestock farmers who are interested in using these things to produce forage, because obviously the industry is quite dependent on imported feed at the moment. And we're doing that across 4 sites, taking quadrats and assessing for fixation in all 7 legumes. There's 7 legumes in these mixtures, and comparing it with the simple mixtures as well to see if first of all, from a physiologist perspective, if the diversity is causing more nitrogen to be fixed, and also from the farmer's perspective, is the diversity causing a greater yield in kilograms per hectare. So we're quite happy with that one as well. And we've also got to put some numbers on the soil structural stuff as well. We've got a really special tool we got imported from the US. It's a giant metal cylinder that takes undisturbed soil cores down to 60 centimeters. And we're hoping to send a few of those to the University of Nottingham with a very high-tech camera, you might say, an X-ray. It's called X-ray tomography. And it takes a photograph straight through the soil core and gives you a really clear picture of, you know, the soil structure, which is the distribution, the shape, the size, the connectivity, the tortuosity, all those things of the gaps between soil particles. And the question we're trying to answer is really kind of, does increasing the diversity of these, does including very deep rooting things like chicory and so on, does it cause changes in soil structure that are, you know, favourable for crop production, I suppose? The kind of sweet spot between holding enough water but not too much water and so on. So that's kind of, the results are kind of coming in, and I hope you'll kind of follow. Stay tuned and see what we get at the end. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Patrick. I just put up that's a picture of one of your soil cores there, I think.
Okay, so we can see the soil cores, yeah. So they're nice and big as well. So it's kind of, the soil coring generally is hindered by this, the cores are just too small, you know. So there's the biggest ones you can get, 9 centimeter diameter. So I think from those, we're going to get a very, very clear idea of what's going on beneath the ground in these leys.
And so in terms of kind of more diverse mixtures, are you seeing more of kind of associations with mycorrhizal, more carbon, kind of better impacts on structure? Is there a relationship between the diversity and these kind of impacts?
That's what we're looking into. The data's still coming in though, so I can't really comment on it at the moment.
Yeah. Fantastic. All right. Well, I think we'll pick up on some more of those questions when we come to the end. We have got another poll question here, and that's just if people are using leys, how are you going about coming out of those leys? Just in terms of how, are you ploughing them and tilling them? And you might be using a combination of these methods. So if you're using more than one in combination, which I imagine many of you are, then just put them all in. And it'd be interesting, just to hear a bit from you guys around the impacts of that, or how that affects some of the benefits we've been talking about here. So many of you spraying it off there, and then combining that with cutting it or grazing it hard, and then direct drilling, I imagine, or then ploughing and shallow tillage, and so roller crimping as well. I wonder who that was. I don't know if any of you want to comment on that, Lydia, in terms of kind of how people should be coming out of, or kind of what the results are showing around destruction. Have you got any comments on that? Or Patrick? Hello? Or Nathan?
I'll just step in case that we've lost them in the field somewhere. I know the project obviously is ongoing, so I don't know how many results we've got to date, but that's certainly one of the interesting points that will be investigated. And a quick plug, one of the long-term studies that NIAB are also running that I help with the STAR, the Sustainable trial in arable rotations in Suffolk. We've also got the complex herbal ley in there as part of a rotation, and that's precisely what we want to look at, is coming out of that herbal ley, it's going back into arable production, and we'll be able to see exactly how the performance from that herbal ley is impacted compared to the other more standard rotations. And obviously in that trial, we also have the cultivations of plough and the different non-inversion type tillage approaches. So we'll get a much better understanding of what impact it has.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okie doke. And then how long a ley of people, what kind of duration of leys, if you're currently using a complex herbal ley, how long do you plan to retain it before returning?
So I think it's at least 2 years, but ideally 4. The kind of the benefits accrue year on year, you know. So I think that's.
So yeah, looking at the poll, the majority of people there are 2 to 3 years. Coming back in there, Lydia.
Can I just make a comment? So we've actually got a BBSRC funded project to look at some of this data that Patrick was talking about. And Jonathan Leek, who's our leader from Sheffield University, he looked at the amount of organic matter and the sort of structure that was enabled by a 2-year just grass clover ley. And then he found a real step up if it was extended to a 3rd year. So one of the things that we're quite interested to find out is, can we get anywhere near that 3rd year with a grass complex herbal ley as Jonathan was getting with his simple grass clover ley? And that's, you know, that's one of the questions that we hope will be answered by this project. But I suspect that there will be, again, a big increase within the herbal ley from the 2nd to the 3rd year. But as I say, we're nowhere near that data yet. We're only partway through.
Fantastic, thanks Lydia. I'm conscious of time, so we will move on now. So obviously if we're looking at these longer, more diverse leys within arable rotations, then we're starting to think about how reintroducing livestock into those systems, either through collaboration or through bringing in your own stock. So I'd like to hand over to Emily, who's going to talk to us about that.
Right, hi everyone. Do I have control? Yes, I do. Sweet. So I'm from Bangor University, and I'm going to quickly talk to you about reintroducing livestock into arable crop rotations. So I am a PhD student and a research technician on the BBSRC SAREC project that Lydia's just mentioned. And my main focus is looking at the livestock health associated with these herbal leys. So why are we so interested in reintroducing livestock back into crop rotations? So soil degradation is a major problem in UK agriculture. It costs England and Wales between 0.9 to 1.2 billion pounds annually. But primarily 85% of this is caused by the loss of soil organic matter and through compaction, either by farm machinery or by livestock. So this is a shared problem that we have in livestock and in arable farming systems. This is quite driven by farm specialisation, which obviously is caused by farm policy, so CAP and all of that. So as we already know, leys can improve soil quality, but can we take that one step further by closing the system, so to speak, by using livestock? So livestock are really crucial at recycling nutrients within the system. In a mown system, typically you're taking all of that biomass and you're taking it away, and you've just taken all of the carbon and nitrogen with it, and you're not giving the soil a chance to recover the benefits from the plant biomass. So other countries are already using programs such as Australia's Grain and Graze program or Brazil's integrated crop livestock system to reintegrate livestock back in the crop rotation. In the UK, we don't really have anything similar other than the arable ley crop rotations. So how are we going to encourage this? We can use flying flocks, or we can use partnerships between farms. So the main key question really is, what is the benefit for the arable farmer? I really hope the screen is going to change, and it did. Yeah, brilliant. one of the main goals of our SARIC project is to look at how soil quality changes with grazing a grass clover and a herbal ley. So we have sites across the UK that are looking at this. So we have sites in Duxford, Norfolk, Essex, and in Leicestershire. While it's too soon to kind of share the results on soil quality with you today, I can kind of talk around what other studies have already done. So, for example, we know that having livestock back on the arable land, you can have the benefits of livestock excreta, so the urine and dung. This can help increase the soil organic matter content. So by trampling in the dung and trampling in biomass, you can increase it that way. Similarly, urine is really loaded with nitrogen, and this can reduce the amount of agrochemical inputs you need for your land. So in Belgium, they found that by grazing cattle on a dairy ley, you reduce the requirement for nitrogen fertilizers by 170 kilograms of N per hectare in the first year of the following arable crop. Similar results were also found for a maize yield following a grazed arable ley. This maize yield was increased by 85% compared to the control, which wasn't grazed at all. So livestock can really do some wonders in terms of nutrient recycling in the system. The other really crucial benefit of livestock is for managing herbicide-resistant weeds. This is going to be an increasing problem the more we're trying to tackle problems like blackgrass. So sheep are really good in particular at mob grazing, and if you force them to eat it, they'll have to eat it. So they will graze down the weed bank, and this can reduce the amount of weeds that you'll then get in your following arable crop. However, livestock aren't the magic bullet, so to speak. You really need to be key at avoiding overgrazing on your land. Overgrazing will open up the plant canopy. This will help encourage other undesirable weeds that you really don't want, and this will increase the compaction on your already weak arable soil. So it's a trade-off between increased nutrient content, reduced agrochemical inputs, weed management, and then you get the disbenefits of compaction and smell. So what are the benefits for the livestock farmers in terms of working with the arable farmers? So we've already heard a little bit from Andrew, and he's one of our farmers on the SARIC project, and he's discussed the benefits that his sheep have had. So livestock farmers in particular gain access to clean grazing pasture, so pasture of an arable field that has reduced parasite burden. So it reduces the chance, or the likelihood of them to gain gastrointestinal parasites. And in particular, if a livestock farmer decides to work with an arable farmer that's using a herbal ley, you gain access to the benefits of the herbal ley for livestock. So herbal leys contain species such as chicory, sandfoin, ribgrass, bird's foot trefoil. This is what Lydia's already shown you, the little pink plant that she's got. And these contain high concentrations of plant secondary metabolites, which we nickname PSMs. These can reduce the parasite burden by reducing the motility of the parasite inside the grazing animal. It can reduce the methane emissions, which is CH4. This is by altering the rumen microbiome, so basically the biology within the sheep. And it can reduce the livestock excreta nitrous dioxide emissions. So this is really crucial for the future of our planet. We'd like to try and reduce the greenhouse gas emissions we're getting from our livestock. So PSMs can do that by shifting the nitrogen content in the excreta from urine, which is really volatile, and that's brilliant for making greenhouse gases, to dung, which is more inert and it's slower to produce greenhouse gases. And it also helps, PSMs can also help increase livestock productivity, particularly seen in a herbal ley. So we have some evidence of this. This is off last year's data from our grazing trial. If it loads, there we go. So in our research trial, we do have these key plants such as sandfoin, chicory, and bird's foot. And I'm not sure if you can see me pointing. So the bottom graph down here shows the fecal egg count data of our site from Norfolk. And it basically found that sheep grazing a grass clover ley, which is the darker green bar here, had a much greater parasite burden than those grazing the herbal ley, which is the really tiny one here. So we are seeing that it is working. These plant secondary metabolites really do work well on the sheep, and it can reduce the parasite burden. But weirdly, we didn't see it for the nematodis in the sheep. We had one sheep that was really laden with parasites, so we probably should have kicked it out of our data set. And as Andrew has said, we are seeing benefits for the weight gain of the sheep. On the Duxford site, which is nearby to where Lydia is currently, the sheep gained about 0.4 kilograms weight per day when they grazed the Herbal Ley, and then when we moved them to the grass clover ley, they lost about 0.1 kilograms per day. So it's a really significant weight gain on the Herbal. So it's really impressive to see. We think that the grass clover weight loss was caused by moving the sheep too quickly onto a new diet, so they had problems there for a little while. Probably gone over time. So yeah, livestock are really good if you'd like to improve your nutrient content of your soil. They're really good for managing weed burdens. For the livestock farmer, if you'd like to access some soil, some grazing pasture that has a pre-existing low parasite burden load, then working with an arable farmer is really beneficial for you. And if you can work with an arable farmer that has a Herbal Ley that has all the added benefits of reduced greenhouse gas emissions, reduced parasite burdens, and benefits for your livestock health. And that's me.
Fantastic, thanks Emily. We had a question around timing of grazing. What time within the project? When are you grazing?
It's different, various sites are grazing at different times. So our Essex site is grazing all year round, basically. Some are going on right after lambing, and then they tend to be grazing towards September, start of October, they take theirs off. So it really varies depending on your soil type and the species mix and your farm structure in general.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So I'll hand back over to James, who has integrated Herbal Leys and is working with a flying stock over in Oxfordshire. Oh, can't hear you, James. There you go.
Is that better?
That's better.
That's better. So we did have a completely stock-free organic enterprise, or the farm we look after. We had 800 acres, no livestock at all, doing very well. One thing we did do, and I always did ever since I took the farm on, was we never let any grass go off the farm. So nothing got taken for silage, as much as some of my neighbours pleaded for it. We'd mulch clover leys 4 or 5 times a year. So everything went back in the soil. Just listen to what Emily was saying about grass leys that are then removed. I'd agree with that. You want to keep everything you can on the farm and in your field. But about 2 years ago, we joined up with the Clark Farming Partnership, who are friends of mine and local sheep and beef farmers. They run a lot of sheep on a lot of farms. They graze cover crops in the winter, parkland, everything. They've really taken to making use of farmers that are growing cover crops and using it for their benefit as well as the arable farmers' benefit. So, say 2 years ago, they started up a solely organic flock because we were limited to 120 days of non-organic livestock. So they've actually started up an organic flock. And I think in the first winter, we actually saw benefits already. They grazed some overwinters cover crops we put in. We had better crop of oats afterwards, I think, than on the rest of the farm. Also, one field we did graze very, very tight down to basically mud. And instead of then ploughing, which is our normal way, we just min-tilled it, and we had as good a crop off the min-tilled field as we had off the fields we ploughed. Obviously a saving in fuel. I wouldn't say we went over the field any less. We still probably cultivated it a number of times to get control of the weeds, but we had no more weeds in the min-till bit than we did in the plough bit. So now they're obviously grazing red clover leys, which I think they're finding good because they've got a lot of clover in. Their lambs seem to grow very quickly, and also in this very dry period we've just had, the clover keeps growing. So they've had continual grazing, whereas in other parts of their grazing they're struggling. One thing I'd say is, if you're an arable farmer, get somebody in with livestock. Don't necessarily do it yourself unless you've got enough time. I always take what the New Zealanders say is, arable farmers grow crops and livestock farmers grow livestock. We're good at what we do for a reason. So I think that'd be the one thing to take away from it all, really.
Yeah, I think there's huge potential, isn't there, in terms of looking at these collaborations. We're doing it at home as well, and really seeing a difference in terms of blackgrass control, and getting that flying stock on the farm. And it's just great to have stock back there, isn't it? It's just that vitality is just brilliant, really.
Yeah.
And would you consider grazing the living mulches if they were to get established this year?
Yes, it's been an option. We've talked. Yeah, I think if we get them established, there's potentially opportunity to graze them in the winter months, maybe, or if we can time it just before we want to plant the next crop. So we graze the living mulch right down, go straight in with a direct drill the crop, and then hopefully the crop gets away and the living mulch sits in the bottom still. The sheep will be better at that than the topper or any sort of mower. That could be potential in the future if we get these living mulches going.
Fantastic, brilliant. Oh, thanks, James. I think we'll start picking up on some of the questions now. We've had one from Hannah Jones. Do you want to ask your question, Hannah? Unmute yourself and.
Yeah. Okay. Hello, everybody. Are there any single pass systems being used by anybody? So with destruction then followed by seeding.
Is anyone aware of anything? Nathan or Lydia? Are there any single pass systems for destruction and seeding? Or anyone on the call? Oh, you're muted, James.
That's better. We have tried crimping and direct drilling behind. It works.
Yeah.
You've got to get your cover crop right in front of the crimper to have all the species that you can kill. Also, I think there's a bit of a myth about crimping that you have to have a hot, dry weather like they have in the States and South America and things where crimping's used a lot. We found actually, I don't think the weather has as much to do with it as you think. It does help, but it's the species you're growing and the timing of crimping that's the key. And it's getting those species to the right timing to the point where you also want to plant the next crop, which is what we're struggling with, really.
So is that stem extension or bud stage? And which crops were you using?
So we've only really been trying vetch and rye or vetch and oats. It's at flowering stage, really, and thesis stage.
Yeah.
I think it's the timing. But I'm not saying that, say, a crop of mustard or radish or something, you could probably kill that with a crimper at any stage if you've got enough stem to crimp. It's having enough time to play at these things, and unfortunately farming is only in a yearly cycle, so it takes a while for us to try everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
Just with your vetch, James, you left it, so you're going to crimp it at the end of this month and then follow it by winter wheat in the autumn. I mean, that sounds very incredibly sensible as sort of toxicity of the crop residues are concerned. I mean, have you got any other experiences of that as far as crop destruction? Because I've heard like smaller seeds can be inhibited.
Yeah, well, like I said, last year we tried it. We crimped a 3-hectare block, and we thought we'd put another cover crop in before, obviously, our winter wheat in October, because we've got all the summer months. But we weren't sure whether we could get small seeds such as mustard and rape and forage radish and stuff to grow, because we had about a 3 or 4 inch thatch of vetch on the surface. So we put together our own mix of everything we had left in the shed, which included beans and oats and mustard and all sorts, just to see what did come. And actually what we found is the mustard came better than anything. So I think if we tried it again, we'd probably put a pure mustard crop in, but a very thick crop, very high seed rate, with the idea that we could then crimp that again in October and plant the winter wheat in. Or if any of it survived, we'd have the frost in the winter, if we had a winter, that could kill the mustard. So buckwheat's another one I'd like to try as well, because I think that could do the same job.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I had another question. If you do have any questions, do feel free to pop them in the chats, but I'm picking up on questions that came through when you all booked your places. So there were quite a few that came up around nitrate leaching, Nathan, and I know that you've touched on that, but a few questions were relating to kind of cover crop mixes and species selection for reducing nitrate leaching. Is there any particular species that you would pick out? And they were just asking, can vetch be used effectively?
So the best species for nitrate capture is your brassicas, your fodder radish and mustard, but the fodder radish is probably the best. There's certainly been some good evidence with a DEFRA demonstration test catchment project that quantified reduction in leaching between 70 and 90% following that radish, compared with a fallow. That was on a Norfolk River catchment. So there's big benefits there. I think some of the legume species, you have to bear in mind that they are slower growing, so may not have such a capacity to sort of capture that nitrogen. And obviously they also fix nitrogen, so they can also put nitrogen back in the system as well. So if you are specifically looking at nitrogen capture, the brassicas are probably the best bet.
Great, yeah, that makes sense, thank you. And then we had a question from Nick Maris. I don't know if Nick's on the phone here, but he was just in terms of tips on using clover as an understory for winter wheat. Is that a possibility when we're looking at these understories? Are we looking mainly at spring cereals, or is it possible within a winter crop as well?
So, James, do you want to go first?
I can do. Yeah. It will go under any crop is the idea. It's a permanent living mulch. We just chose spring barley as our starting point, as it's easy to get the clover undersown. On the organic farm where we've got the trial, it will go into, I'd say, winter oats / spring oats, depending on when we drill them. On the conventional farm, it will actually go into oilseed rape. So, yeah, don't see any problems. We have actually thought on a conventional farm that maybe undersowing the oilseed rape would be the best option, because we've got a more open canopy at the bottom, especially this time of year. Obviously, you've got to think about on a conventional farm what you're spraying. Do you need to spray anything for broadleafs? You don't want to take out this living mulch. You can. I have sprayed white clover before with 4 litres of glyphosate and it doesn't kill it. So you have still probably got the option of a bit of glyphosate if you need to, in a desperate measure, maybe.
Yeah, just knocking it back. Which species are you using? So it's just a normal white clover, is it a micro clover?
Cotswold grass seeds. It's a bit of a mix. Yeah, I don't know who's on from Cotswold.
It's Sam. Yeah.
Well, Sam will know. It's his wonderful mix. It's some small leaf clovers, basically, for layman's.
Great.
So, can I just add to that? Have we got time, or do you want to move on?
Yeah, no, go ahead.
But just with our experience, as James mentioned there, that you can pretty much put that clover into any crop. We've generally established it in sort of early August ahead of a winter cereal, either wheat or barley, and that's worked very well. We've used a small-leaved white clover, either Aber Herald or Aber Pearl, the 2 species that we've used, and they've worked well. Particularly because they're small leaf, quite low growing, so they don't interfere with the canopy and harvest. And the cover crops, the clover certainly grows pretty well in most of the arable conventional sort of approach with regards to herbicides. Certainly once it's established, as James mentioned, you can put on a bit of glyphosate and it'll give it a headache, but it certainly won't kill it. So actually, as a management approach and technique, within your rotation, it can be quite beneficial. And the only other thing just to watch is we had an experience within our rotation where we've grown a winter cereal and then a spring cereal. So it was actually the third year of the clover that we went into a winter oilseed rape. And because of the actual size of the clover and its root growth, we were probably a little bit too cautious on the cultivation ahead. We don't plough, obviously. We do a sort of a low disturbance tillage. And actually, when we put the oilseed rape in, I don't think we quite had the till for the oilseed rape, so it did struggle to establish with that living clover. So you just need to be cautious of that.
Great, thank you. We had a question come through there about seed rates, and Sam's answered that, so it is on the chat there. Going to the Leys, we had a number of questions around soil organic matter and carbon and kind of changes over time and potential for carbon sequestration and stability. Lydia and Patrick, are you still there? Have you got some thoughts on that? We can, yeah, you're very quiet, but we can hear you.
Hello?
There we go, that's better, yeah.
Ah. Go on, Patrick, you start.
Right, so there's organic matter and organic carbon. They are different things, and we are assessing both of them. So just over a year of assessments of soil of organic matter percentages between the 0 to 30 horizon and the 30 to 60 horizon, we've seen no significant changes in any treatments apart from one, which is our sandy soil out in Nottingham, which just increased marginally in the 0 to 30 centimetres. That's about what you'd expect in just a short time period. You know, it's kind of the accumulation of soil organic matter is kind of it's a long game, really. But soil organic carbon is a bit more interesting because you can break it down by aggregate size. That's what we're trying to do. So we don't expect to see very significant increases in soil organic carbon in something like the 0 to 30 centimetre horizon or any depth increments. But what a lot of the literature says is that carbon tends to accumulate in the 1 mil to 2 mil size aggregate much faster than anywhere else. So we're looking at that in the 0 to 5, 5 to 10, and 10 to 30 centimetre horizons to see if that's happening in our Leys in a short period of time, because a lot of other researchers have found that in that exact aggregate size, the organic carbon can increase. Yeah. But generally, it's kind of a long-term game, really. Don't expect to see it majorly in a short number of years.
And does that tend to that? Oh, yes, please. Yeah.
So there's been some quite long-term experiments that have been done by NIAB people. In particular, there was one that Stuart and Ron did when Ron was still with us, where organic matter in the form of chopped straw and various things was added sequentially over several years. And they didn't find a particularly large or practically unmeasurable statistically increase in soil organic matter. However, they did get really nice changes in soil structure. And don't forget that the contribution of the soil microbial community can be quite small in terms of total organic matter, but it has quite an important effect on gluing soil particles together and giving you that sort of micro porosity, never mind the macro porosity, which is enabled by the roots and so forth. So you start to get changes in measures of soil health, and you might want to check out some of the work that's ongoing at NIAB under Liz Stockdale over measurements of soil health. But these sorts of things are slightly more difficult to measure, and the amount of complicated and different carbon species of one type or another that you get coming out of the roots of these very different mixed species means that you get lots of different types of chemicals. You therefore are able to feed a larger number and diversity of different microbiology, and so you tend to get a more diverse and interesting soil microbial community, and that tends to give you ultimately a healthier soil. But it is a waiting game as well, and we're not going to get changes in 1 year, which is why we're really keen to see what happens over 2 years and then over 3 years.
Absolutely, yeah. It's looking at those longer term benefits over the whole rotation, which is why it's so interesting seeing the work that you're doing, Nathan, and also for farmers sharing their own experiences on that. So thank you very much. We're pretty much out of time. We do have one last final poll, which was just if people would consider integrating livestock into your rotation. So I don't know if that might have changed as a result of this, only joking. But if it's something that you were considering. So some of you looking at having your own livestock as well. So great. But not grazing. Oh, yep, some people grazing cattle as well. Great. There we go. So we've got a number of you considering flying sheep flock, and yeah, also collaboration with farmers in terms of cutting for silage and hay. One thing we didn't get onto here was the GS4 option, which I'm sure many of you are aware of as well, in terms of looking at how this can tie in to countryside stewardship as well. So I think we will wrap up, but many of us will stick around afterwards. So if you have more questions that you wanted to ask, we will still be here. I will just hand over to Laura Harper. Are you there, Laura? Say a few words about CFE.
Hello, yes I am. I'm just going to put my video on. Hopefully it doesn't matter. See? Back and forth. There we are. Is that working okay?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Katie. Yeah, just in terms of, as you say, a wrap up and potential next steps. I know quite a few people who've dialed in today will already be exploring some of the options that we're talking about, but if you are right at the start of your journey, then CFE might be a good place to start. For those of you who don't know, CFE is championing the farm environment, previously campaigned for the farm environment for the last 10 years or so. And it's a partnership of agricultural, environmental and government organisations promoting good environmental management through productive farming practices. We offer intro-level guidance on environmental management across air, water, wildlife, climate change and soil management. And that includes some of the things that we've covered today around cover crops, addressing compaction, drainage, soil erosion and soil health more broadly. And obviously there's quite an overlap between the themes that we look at. So I'd say CFE is a good place to explore your first steps in environmental management. And as a partnership, thank you, Katie, there's a breakdown of some of the partners that we work with. We can also signpost for next steps with those who have expertise in the areas, including NIAB and some of the great speakers that we've heard from today. So we are running webinars and launching a podcast. In previous years at this time we will be out and about at events, but that's not an option for any of us at the moment. But we do build straightforward online guidance that's written for farmers and members of the farming community, and hopefully it'll be a good and helpful place for people to start if they are thinking about integrating some of these environmental management practices into their business. So cfeonline.org.uk is the website. And as I said, there's lots of guidance there, but also links out to further expertise, which I hope you will find useful. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Laura. And then also, yeah, on Agricology, we will pull together the recording from today. So I'm aware we've covered a lot of ground, as I said before. And we've kind of really had a real whistle-stop tour through these various options for alternative breaks within the arable rotation, but there is a lot more resources there in terms of videos and technical guides. And I will send around an email to everyone with some of the links to things we were talking about today, some of that, the NIAB research, and some of the work that James has been doing as well. This is part of a series of events, as I mentioned. There's a lot going on online. This week, obviously, is part of Cereals Live, which this is as well. We've got a session on Wednesday on non-chemical approaches, where we'll be looking at various options for integrated pest management. Do join us for that at 1 p.m. And there's various other sessions running over Cereals Live. We've got sessions on IPM with leaf, climate change, resilient systems. And then for the National Organic Combinable Crops will be online this year, and that's very much open to everyone. So there'll be a conversation between Clive Bailey and John Pawsey as part of that, and a discussion with Charlotte Smith from Farming Today on land sharing versus land sparing on the 14th of July. But all the details of all these events are on the Agricology website, so do take a look there. And thank you, everyone. Thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you for being so brave and being out there in the field and trying out this technology. I think it kind of worked, didn't it? James has been able to crack on. That's good. And we've got, the guys in the field. So I think thank you to everyone for your patience as well. We understand it's not the same as being in the field, and it wasn't, it's not always so easy to follow on these things. But yeah, thank you very much and stay safe, and hope to see you all again sometime soon. And like I say, we will hang around on the phone here if anyone has any further questions. I see Henry's popped one on there, so we will pick that up. But for anyone that needs to go now, thank you very much, and see you soon. In terms of basis points, I'll do that for you, so it will go through automatically. If you've put down on the list that you would like basis points, I will put that through to basis after this. And if you didn't, then email me and I will with your number. Fantastic. I've got a question here. Shall I pick that up, Lydia? I see you just put your video back on. So Henry, is Henry on the line? Do you want to ask your question, Henry?
Yeah, hello. Yeah, my understanding is that organic farmers, particularly who have practiced multi-species cover crops or herbal leys, have always rotational grazed them, and some really masses of paddocks. So they were grazing them, maybe moving them once a day or even twice a day, which is obviously quite a bit of infrastructure. And it's to avoid overgrazing. And I was wondering whether there's any who's got experience of that, or whether you can get away with set stocking.
So I'm going to start by saying I am absolutely not a livestock farmer, and it's not my expertise. But just as a result of doing this work over the few years, I would say that working with Cotswold Seeds, who happen to provide the ley we talked about today, they've been looking at mob grazing and looking at how that impacts on the biodiversity of the ley over the years. And one thing's absolutely certain, that you do lose species out of it. Which ones you use, you lose depends upon the site and the year and everything, as well as the amount of grazing. But I'll hand over to Patrick in a minute, because we've been looking at working with a number of farmers on the project we have running, and different farmers are grazing this differently. So Andrew, who talked to you earlier, he's totally under our control, and so he's allowed to put his sheep on for a mere sort of 10 days, and then he takes them off and then brings them back again a bit later in the year. Whereas some of our other farmers are grazing it much more closely. And I'm going to hand over to Patrick, because he's really been assessing the diversity of the different species and the biomass of different species, and certainly we are losing them out of those heavily grazed sites.
Yeah. So like Lydia was saying, yeah, we've got 5 trial sites. One is mob grazed, and that's the one with Andrew. The sheep come for about 10 days, twice a year, and graze it. The rest are continuous grazing. And I wouldn't say we've seen too much of a strong effect on the diversity of species between the grazing and the mowing treatments, but certainly the grazing, once it gets grazed down to a certain level, it struggles to recover. So the duckswood grazing plots are pretty much identical to the mowing plots, but they've only been grazed for 10 days. In every other one, there's a very clear difference between the two that we've seen, because continuous grazing seems to have meant a little bit overgrazing in most of our trial sites. But they're on real farms, so it's hard to have a really strong experiment on it when the farmer needs forage or needs to graze or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And Hannah's just suggested looking at a cell grazing project at Northwick. It's actually something we did a couple of previous events a few weeks back on multi-species leys, and last week looking at grazing management with Rothamsted. So we'll be sharing that recording shortly, and I'll share that around. Do you want to say a few words about the cell grazing project, Hannah?
I don't work on it. I was just listening to the presentation. But it's just what we see from our farmers grazing the herbal leys, that much diversity is maintained with a kind of mob grazing approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it just seemed to, of all the options that they were looking at there, it came out in terms of managing that, maintaining that diversity. Have we got any other questions on the line? Anyone else with a burning question? If not, we shall let everyone get on with their days. Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to all our speakers. You've been fantastic. For